by Chief Kisa Sousa, U.S. Navy from Naval Information Warfare Pacific.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the Rockies rang glare, the bombs bursting in air gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. At this time, please join me in welcoming to the stage Vice Admiral Peter Daly, U.S. Navy retired, Chief Executive Officer and Publisher of the U.S. Naval Institute.
Good morning. Let's give our honor guard and Chief Sousa a quick hand for that. So good morning, I'm Pete Daly, CEO, Publisher, Naval Institute, and on behalf of the Naval Institute and AFCEA International, we welcome all of you to West 2020. Our conference theme is, Are we ready to confront great power competition? And the subtext could easily be restated as, do we have strategy, resources, and execution properly aligned? This is such an important moment to bring the leaders of the sea services, the thought leaders, other senior uniform leaders, corporate, and many of our retired community together to look at the issues that face us today. The town hall discussion with the service chiefs is always one of the highlights, and I can't think of a better place to start than right here. And we're pleased to have the support of Lockheed Martin as our sponsor for this keynote event, and I would like to now call Jim Sheridan from Lockheed Martin up to the stage to say just a few words before we kick off.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Admiral Daly. And I have to agree with you. What a great rendition of our national anthem. That was a great job. I think another round of applause for Chief Souza is in order. So I'm honored to represent Lockheed Martin at AFCEA and the U.S. Naval Institute's West 2020 conference. I'm always impressed with the conference agenda and its ability to attract the highest level of speakers from across the armed forces and the steady growth in our attendance, as you can look around and see in this room. I have to say that all the defense industry trade show events I attend, this town hall is the event that I look forward to the most. Hearing directly from the Sea Service chiefs helps attendees understand and respond to pressing needs across the sea services. As Pete mentioned, this year's theme is, are we ready to confront great power competition? The theme is incredibly relevant and aligns with the National Defense Strategy and the recently released FY21 budget request. As the adversaries work to erode the technological advantage of the United States, our sailors, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen must be prepared with next-generation capabilities that address these evolving threats. At Lockheed Martin, our employees use the phrase, "Your mission is ours," to describe the why behind what it is we do. It reminds us that our customers' missions come first. Knowing the work we do plays a role in supporting Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard missions is a tremendous motivation and point of pride for each and every one of our employees. So on behalf of Lockheed Martin, thank you all for attending today's town hall, and a special thanks to Admiral Schultz, General Berger, Admiral Gilday, and Secretary Work for spending their precious time today to share their perspectives and insights with us. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Jim. Thank you, Lockheed Martin. And it's now my great pleasure to introduce the moderator for the town hall discussion, Secretary Bob Work. Secretary Work served as the 32nd Deputy Secretary of Defense for 3 different SecDefs across 2 administrations. Previously, he served as CEO for the Center for New American Security, and from 2009 to 2013, he served as Undersecretary of the Navy. Mr. Work is currently back at CNAS as a Distinguished Senior Fellow. He's also a counselor at the Telemus Group, a Senior Fellow at Johns Hopkins APL, and a Distinguished Visiting Fellow at MITRE Corporation. He served 27 years on active duty as a Marine officer across a wide range of positions, including command of an artillery battery and an artillery battalion. We at the Naval Institute are very proud that he is currently the chair of our board of directors. So let's give a warm welcome as I invite Secretary Bob Work, Commandant of the Marine Corps General Dave Berger, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Mike Gilday, and Commandant of the Coast Guard Admiral Karl Schultz to the stage.
Secretary. Always good.
Hey, how you doing, Commandant?
I'm great, sir. I'm good.
All right, Commandant.
Sir.
Michael. Mike. Hoorah.
Mr. Secretary.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Pete, and good morning, everyone, to the kickoff session of the 30th Annual West Conference. We're blessed to have all 3 of the top leaders of our sea services here today. This is unusual. It's harder to get all 3 of their schedules aligned than it is to get 3 carrier strike groups aligned. But we have from my right, your left, Commandant Schultz, Commandant of the Coast Guard. He's been in his job longer than any of the 3 senior leaders, becoming the 26th Commandant of the Coast Guard in June 1st, 2018. And you take a look at his career, and I'm not an expert at all in Coast Guard careers, but as you read it, you say, okay, I get it. This is a Coast Guardsman through and through. He commanded a 110-foot island-class patrol boat, a 180-foot seagoing buoy tender, a 270-foot famous class, medium-class cutter. He was in charge of the 11th District, which encompasses all of California. He was in charge of the Coast Guard sector in Miami and was the commander of the Coast Guard Atlantic area, which also was dual-hatted as Coast Guard Defense Force East. Also was the director of Ops, J3, down at the U.S. Southern Command. So I'd like you to all join me in welcoming a distinguished Coast Guardsman and 26th Commandant of the Coast Guard. Admiral Mike Gilday. He became the 32nd CNO back in August of 2019. U.S. Naval Academy graduate as a SWO. And if you take a look at his career as a SWO, and it's quite remarkable. He served on the Chandler, which was a kid-class destroyer, the USS Princeton, which was a Tycho. He commanded 2 destroyers, the Higgins and the Benfold, Flight 1, Flight 2 Arleigh Burke, commander of Destroyer Squadron 7, and commander of CSG 8, the Truman Carrier Strike Group. So if you're a SWO daddy, I mean, this is a pretty good career progression. He was also the 10th Fleet and Fleet Cyber Command and was the director of the Joint Staff when he was picked to be the 32nd Chief of Naval Operations. Thank you for being here, Mike.
Thank you.
Please. The General Dave Berger is 38th Commandant of the Marine Corps, and he was assumed his job within about a month of Admiral Gilday on July 11th, 2019. He's an infantryman, and just like our other 2 panelists, you take a look at his career and say, okay, this is a Marine through and through. Commanded a Recon Company, 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, Regimental Combat Team 8 in Fallujah, 1st Marine Division Forward in Afghanistan. He was in charge of the MAGTF Training Command at 29 Palms, commanded the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force, Fleet Marine Forces Pacific, and was the commanding general of the Marine Corps Combat Development Command when he was picked as the commandant. Hoorah, pretty serious. You know, I'm a Marine too, so not as good as a Marine as a commandant. But thank you for being here, Commandant. Now we're going to spend about 40 minutes talking among ourselves, and then we'll turn it over to questions in the audience. I'm going to break it down roughly 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 in terms of readiness, capabilities, and personnel. So I'm going to start off with readiness, which I know is a key theme on everyone here. And I want to start with a topical issue of the day, the coronavirus. And as you're answering, I'll use my, since I shook all your hands, I'm going to take the opportunity, and I'll pass this around. But has the pandemic affected fleet operations and training in any material way? I noted that PAC Fleet has said there's going to be a 14-day delay between any port calls. I know some exercises have been canceled, but I don't know how many. So I just wanted to start off, if you could give the audience just a real quick kind of overview on, do you see it having an impact yet? Why don't we start with the Commandant and come this way?
Sure, I'll tell you this, Secretary. First off, for the Coast Guard, our people and interfacing on the waterfront and the regulated maritime community, this is a significant issue. You know, sitting in DHS, this is one of those places where you say, why wouldn't you have the 5th Armed Service, and now 5 of 6 armed services, maybe in DOD? This is one of those places where it makes perfect sense. You know, we do the arrivals of passengers in the United States. CBP, Customs Border Protection, looks at cargo. So we're intimately involved. About 4,000 ships a month call on the United States, about 750 here on the Pacific. We're screening every one of those ships. So ships that are coming out of China, other than Hong Kong and Macau, you know, if they're coming in on, 14 days or less at sea, we are keenly scrubbing those lists of crew. We want to make sure who's on board. passenger vessels that have less than 14 days during that incubation period are being detained at sea. Cargo operations, we're working with shippers, we're working with, if there's a crew member that's identified, you know, we're working with CDC and other local health officials to be on top of that. You know, walking it back into the force, you know, personal protective equipment for our folks, policy, we're starting to get into that realm here as it's becoming an increasingly evolving domestic situation, you know, policies in terms of folks on leave, you know, people got spring break coming up where they want to travel. I think we're deeply involved with this, and being in DHS, this is one of those places where our regulatory roles, I think, sit outside the Department of Defense, but they're a good fit in DHS, and we partner, you know, outside of a crisis. We work in this theme with Homeland Security, with Health and Human Services, with FEMA on a persistent basis. So I think when an episodic situation like this comes up, we're ready to press in on that.
So you know, any impact on training or readiness yet?
Not significant. So our connections really from the services are up through the department and then the CDC and the World Health Organization. So we're executing through the combatant commanders and, of course, in the United States through the U.S. Northern Command. The coronavirus manifests itself in different ways depending upon the location. And so what we're seeing across the combatant commands is a variety of steps that they're taking, some more pronounced than others depending upon the location of concentration areas of the virus. So, for example, for 6th Fleet out of Naples, we've prohibited travel up in northern Italy due to the concentration of the outbreak there. Same thing in certain spots in Asia. We've trained our medical personnel to be able to identify the symptoms and then test and then isolate, quarantine until we confirm whether or not it's an active case. We have taken a look at port visits, and again, based on those regional estimates, made decisions about canceling port visits, scaling back exercises. We have, you mentioned the Pacific Command specifically. And so with respect to port visits, we are testing crews before they go ashore, testing crews before they come back, putting out guidance on, with respect to liberty in terms of where they go, how long they can be out. So we're trying to, you know, at this point, obviously we have not contained the virus from the continental United States, and so we're trying to mitigate as best we can given what we know.
But at this point, there are no sailors who have contracted the disease?
Not at this point.
Commandant?
Probably 2 points. First, a great job by, you have to help me here, but Miramar up the road, Lackland,
Yep.
Travis. Do you remember what the other ones were?
Hawaii.
Hawaii.
Joint Base
It's
Pearl.
one Nebraska.
Department of Defense was asked, hey, can you house American citizens or other folks coming back and would be under quarantine? I mean, really quickly, the base commanders, this is where 06 commanders, you know, make their money, because it's not going to get solved from Washington, D.C., but the base commanders just knocked it out of the park. Quickly made all the arrangements, work really closely with the interagency on quarantine measures and all that sort of thing. I didn't hear, I don't know about y'all, but I didn't hear one hiccup in all that. I'm sure there were, but that's a tribute to the quality of the base commanders. Outside, I think the biggest impact so far has been on the command post exercise in Korea, which had to be tailored way back because of the spread of the disease. Does that impact readiness? I think that's a great question for General Abrams. You know, he would be the best judge of that. But for us, trim down that. But on the other hand, like Cobra Gold exercise that went in Thailand, we went full up in there. So like he said, Admiral Davidson's published really good guidance, as has the European Command Commander, Southcom Commander. They've all published really detailed guidance. So far, not a big impact.
Great. And no Marines have
No.
been affected, and no Coast Guardsmen or women? All right. In my view, I was in the department as a senior political official for 4 of the 5, what I'll call the BCA years, the BCA sequestration years. And in my view, the way you have to look at this is during these 5 years, we had more force structure than the budget we were allocated. In other words, we knew it. We made a conscious decision not to cut force structure. It was a hard decision because the force structure was too big for the budget we had. At the same time, the force structure was too small for what it was being asked to do. original thinking in the 90s, excuse me, was if you got into the first war, you would start to pare back on presence operations around the world so that you could maintain readiness for the second major combat operation or major theater war or however, whatever you wanted to call. But we didn't pare back. And then, I don't know, I mean, I remember the term reset and reconstitution. After we left Afghanistan or stopped combat operations, we were supposed to take time to reset the force, which we knew if you have, too much force structure for the budget you have, and it's not big enough for what it's being asked to do, the place where it impacts is readiness. You really start to pare away readiness rapidly. So what I want to ask all three of you is somewhere between 2015 and 2017, we kind of hit rock bottom in terms of the readiness impacts of sequestration in the BCA. And let's set that as a relative score of 0. That was just the kind of low point. We've now seen several years of more budget. Where would you rate the overall readiness of your respective services now against the low point of the BCA years? Commandant.
Two aspects inside that, like you're well aware, sir. One is the amount, and one is the when you get the funding. Because if you get a continuing resolution, it just compounds the problem. Because the commanders don't have the funds, they don't know how much they have to operate with. So that, I just want to amplify, as much as the amount matters, and it does, timing, the unpredictability is huge on the force and on industry. I think for us, on a scale, what you're asking, like 0 to 10, kind of. If we were at a 0, I would say we're at a 6 or a 7, probably now. We don't have the big capital, assets like Admiral Gilday does. So ours is training and manpower. You can rebound faster than you can deferred maintenance or something like that on a big capital asset. Marines are never going to be happy, but I would put us probably at a 6 or a 7.
That's not bad.
No.
That's a pretty good improvement in a relatively short period of time. And to amplify what the Commandant is saying, we were in a continuing resolution about 30% of the time in the BCA years. So in effect, we had an 8-month fiscal year, which, as the Commandant said, plays hell on trying to do any type of planning. So how's it looking?
Yeah, I'd give us a 5 or a 6, but I want to provide a little bit of context to that. So in terms of budget stability, if you take a look at the last decade, we've had continuing resolutions for about, on average, 35 days a year. So that's about 40% of the year. So there's a lot of instability there, right, in terms of maintenance and modernization, in particular, work that you want to get done, as well as new contracts that you want to start, hundreds of thousands of contracts that you can't start on time. So if I'd back up just a little bit and give you some examples about how we use the force in the period of, let's say, 2007 and 2014, at that time, I think we did 8 double pump carrier strike group deployments. At one point, the Ike had gone out and deployed 4 times with only 1 maintenance availability between those deployments. So that, coupled with a significant reduction in the workforce at our shipyards, we've increased over several years 10,000 workers back in order to handle a workload. At times we were running 500 days behind on submarine maintenance, as an example. And so you had this very high up tempo, right? At the same time, you're trying to catch up under a compressed budget scenario. So what we're doing now is we're essentially holding the line, and we're saying, look, across those readiness pillars, whether it's manpower that we're buying back, or whether it's modernization that we're now paying for, maintenance that we're now paying for that's been deferred for a long time, stocks in the supply shelves that we're investing in, training where we're going to live virtual construct. And so we've essentially said, look, we are going to make sure that stuff is fully funded. And what's sacrificed, of course, is the slope of the line in terms of buying capacity, which is new ships. But based on the budget that we have today, and if I project that out for a while, and I assumed no growth, and we really haven't had growth over the past decade. It's been constant. We can really afford a Navy of between 305 and 310 ships. Right now, we're at 295. And so if you want a fleet that's going to be ready, capable, and lethal, you got to make those investments, rather than a bigger fleet that's less ready, less capable, less lethal. So a long answer to your question, but we are still feeling the ramifications of op-tempo, of challenges that we've had in shipyards with respect to a workforce. And that maintenance piece is really the key piece in terms of capital ships, in terms of getting them out and ready to go.
Thank you. Commandant?
Yeah, let me start. I think where the nation's Coast Guard should be would be about 5% annual operations support growth and approaching a $2 billion major acquisitions capital account. That's what it takes to have a healthy Coast Guard. If I answer your question about the score, I would put us probably at the 3 or 4 level. But there's some encouraging news here coming out of the 20 cycle and going into the 21 budget cycle. Since the Budget Control Act of 2011, we've lost 10% purchasing power. And unlike our DOD brethren here, when National Security Presidential Memorandum number 1 came out and sort of addressed this readiness and gave a booster shot in 2018 of about 12%, we weren't part of that conversation. And we're a capital-intensive organization. We've got the same people challenges in a competitive environment. So I would say we've lost that 10%. 20 budget gave us about 4.5% positive growth. 21, the budget's presidential submission builds on that. I'm encouraged. My number one priority, Bob, coming in the job has been really big R readiness. I talk readiness every single day. It's incumbent on me to take that narrative to the Hill, to take it to the Department of Homeland Security, take it across the river as we support the combatant commanders. So I'm encouraged. I think we've got to continue to beat that drum. We're a workforce where 40% of our enlisted men and women went to 20 years yesteryear before blended retirement system, 60% of our officers. So just getting folks to the gates in our training center in Cape May and then retaining them. We're an apprentice, journeyman, subject matter expert organization. On the technical side, as the waterfront's increasingly sophisticated, our regulatory stuff, if we don't keep folks in and beyond 12 years, I got to tell you, it's going to be a very different Coast Guard. So I'm encouraged. I think we're on a good trajectory. We've got to do some real upgrades on things like our innovative capabilities, putting mobility in people's hands, our C5I backbone, just on the stuff we do to enable day-to-day Coast Guard operations. We got some real opportunities, but I think we're starting to have the right conversations. So if we could get on a trajectory, building on that 4.5%, 5% growth, and project that forward, I think we can deliver the Coast Guard the nation needs here to support the Homeland Security Department and support our combatant commander colleagues there.
Thank you. I think you all know this. I think the Trump bump, the big increase in defense spending that occurred starting in 17 and went through 20. Essentially what it tried to do was better balance personnel, operations and maintenance, and modernization for the force structure we have. And we were very clear, Secretary Mattis especially so, that this doesn't appreciably grow the force. It puts it in better balance. We can buy munitions. We can put more money into facilities maintenance, et cetera, et cetera. If you want to grow the force, you need 3 to 5% real growth year over year for a sustained period of time. So the reason why I wanted to start with this question, and I thought the answer is 3 to 7, a lot of people would say, oh my gosh, this doesn't sound too good. To me, it sounds real good based on where we were, and it's just, we got a long way to go. So thank you all.
Maybe a little less good if you're the Coast Guard side, but getting better.
All right. The theme of today's, or West 2020, is are we ready to confront great power competition? And this afternoon, we have a panel that asks the question, are we ready to fight and win in a fully contested zone? How would you answer that question? I know it's a huge question, and we could probably spend an hour just on that. But for the audience, how confident or how comfortable are you where we stand right now vis-a-vis our great power competitors? Why don't we start with the CNO?
I think it depends on the fight, but I feel pretty good. Actually, I feel very good when I think about the synergy across all domains, right? And so it's not just singularly any one service in terms of what we're bringing to the fight. And the other thing that we've taken a look at is that these are global fights, and so we intend to fight them trans-regionally as well. And so we would come at an adversary across many vectors, across all domains. And so from that perspective, in terms of exercises that I've observed and war games that I've participated in, I feel pretty good about our position.
Commandant Berger?
We are ready. But I think we're also, we are relearning what great power competition is over the long haul, where 2 or 3 great powers are pacing off of each other. But you could have, in other words, the answer to your question might be X this afternoon, but both are moving. So it's a question you have to ask all the time, because they're making development, they're making changes to try to stay in front of us. We are doing the same. So are we ready for them now becomes a temporal question. In other words, this afternoon, 6 months from now, 2 years from now, if either one stays static, it goes out of balance. So this is something we're going to have to press hard on continuously. As long as we have pacing threats, you can't lay off.
And Commandant, since you took over, you've made improving readiness in the Coast Guard your top priority. And in your most recent State of the Coast Guard address, you started to outline some of the means in which you're getting after improving readiness. Do you want to cover some of those for us this morning?
Yeah, let me maybe put in the context of the last question. I think when you think about the national defense strategy, our contributions are really below that level of armed conflict. And I think we bring a lot to the fight on that continuum from cooperation to competition. We've sent a couple heel-to-toe rotations of national security cutters out to the 7th Fleet, and I think from the standpoint, are we ready? We're ready to contribute more to that fight, solving this readiness conversation. That's important. I left about 550, 600 cutter days on the table last year because of what we call 4X ONS operations support dollars that could be in the fight. I would like to continue to support the CNO and the combatant commanders to the extent they want. I think we bring, when Joe Langell, the National Guard Bureau Chief, came through the Pacific here, we went down to Antarctica recently, he came through the Pacific Island nations, he says, Karl, everyone ran up to me and says, hey, great to see you, General, but we want to see more Coast Guard here. I think we bring that human-to-human interaction in places along that pathway from Hawaii to Asia. I talked to the ASEAN nations, and you talk to the 5 big maritime partners there. I think they see a law enforcement problem set out there. I think the Coast Guard can bring some of that things to the fight. So for us, it's the readiness conversation is really about being able to press in there, bringing that human-to-human interaction along that continuum below the level of armed conflict. I want to make sure we're able to push things in the fight. It's our patrol boats on the Arabian Gulf. So I think we're getting better, but I think there's a cost to those things, Bob. And that's what, as we talk readiness, it's our people, it's our domestic missions, it's our families, then it's that ability to contribute to the national defense here and the bigger conversation about the national defense strategy.
Thanks. Some people like to watch the World Series and the Super Bowl. I like to watch congressional testimony. And last week, I would have to say that it was a remarkable set of testimony. And CNO, last week, Secretary Esper claimed that the optimized fleet response plan hasn't worked for years, so why should we expect it to work in the future? And therefore, essentially what he said is, I don't trust the planning. I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond, because I thought it was quite remarkable.
Yeah, I don't necessarily agree with the Secretary's assessment. I say that with all due respect, but we have met and projecting to the future continue to meet every commitment, every deployment that we've been directed to do. The fleet response plan itself, the optimized fleet response plan, is supposed to do 4 things. So the first thing it's supposed to do is rotate the force, right? And that force is a SecDef-directed force to provide immediate response and set the globe. The second thing it's supposed to do is be able to surge the force in terms of crisis. And so we have forces in sustainment, many that are either working up for deployment or just back from deployment, that are ready for a period of about 14 months to surge if required. And we've called in those surge forces a lot. The third thing that the construct allows you to do is to maintain and modernize the force so it remains operationally relevant. And the last thing it does is it gives you the ability to reset the force if you do have to surge for crisis. So we learned a lot, in previous models that go back to 1992 when we had the interdeployment training cycle and then we had the fleet response plan, and we weren't necessarily developing a surge force. I talked a little about in an earlier question about, I commented on the up-tempo that we had with double pumping carriers, 9 to 11 month deployments. So the OFRP has also given a degree of stability for our sailors. When I came into the job, I directed U.S. Fleet Forces Command and the Commander of the Pacific Fleet to conduct an assessment of OFRP because it's been 5 or 6 years since we put it into place. And I had questions myself coming out of the Joint Staff on plans that I had observed that at a minimum I thought we were going to need, we were going to have to buy more surge. Secretary Esper asked for a separate independent assessment of OFRP. That's ongoing. I think we have another meeting with him this week with this outside agency that's going to present their findings. And the Navy's been very much a part of working on that. I think at the end of the day, what we have to do is understand what the Secretary of Defense really wants with respect to either increased presence today or increased surge, or a combination of both of those. And the question is, so in an OFRP cycle of 36 months, and only about, so there's 52% of the force that's in that 36-month model, right? That 36-month construct. SSNs, SSBNs, your FD&F forces, your military SEAL forces are not in a 36-month cycle. But it's taken a look at, you know, the maintenance phase, and we're doing a lot to improve in the maintenance phase, the training phase, and so if I take both of those together, nominally they're about 14 or 15 months, and then the remainder of that, of the OFRP, the remaining 21 to 22 months, that's for employability. And so right now we do a 7-month deployment, and then the strike group or the ARG spends 14 months in surge. If we want to change how we deploy in that, within that 22 months, we can take a look at that. We can take a look at the cost of that, right? And not to drag this out too long, but the paradigm has completely changed with the NDS in terms of how we identify what we need in terms of capacity-ready forces. And so before Secretary Mattis signed out the NDS, it was a demand-driven model based on what the COCOMs wanted. And they were never satisfied because we just didn't have enough to go around. Now it's a top-down driven model. So the Secretary of Defense says, you will have this many forces of these types ready to go in 0 to 10 days. So on any given day, the Navy has 90 to 105 ships deployed. So those ships, those players are on the field. The Secretary then has his responsibility is to prioritize how you want to use those forces. It takes into account the Navy's force generation model and the fact that we're recovering from readiness, as we already talked about. So all that is factored in, along with globally integrated base plans and stressing O plans to figure what we need out there today to set the globe, and then what you need to surge. A long answer to your question, and I'm sure that I'll get a follow-up from the audience, but the bottom line is OFRP is meeting the mark. We are digging into the maintenance side, and I can talk about that later. And on the training side, we're doing very, very well.
Thank you. I want to shift more to the capabilities now. And also last week, the size of the fleet, how fast you get there, how much it costs, was very much kind of central in Congress in all of the testimonies. So I'd like to ask both UCNO and Commandant, where are we in this debate? I mean, do we have a number? Are we shooting towards a number? Acting Secretary Modley said we need another 120 to 130 billion over the next 10 years if we were to try to hit the 355. Sometimes unmanned are in, sometimes unmanned are out. Can you give us a sense on where that debate is right now and where it might be heading?
Want me to start? So, when the Commandant and I both came in office, we shook hands and agreed to do an integrated force structure assessment. So we hadn't done one, the Navy hadn't done one since 2016, and that fed the, actually, that was the baseline for the NDAA, the law which established 355 numbers, the law of the land for ships. And so we decided not to do a coordinated assessment, but an integrated assessment. And so our staffs worked together. We did modeling and simulation down at McCittick. We did it within the Pentagon. but we not only took into account distributed maritime operations conceptually on the Navy side and the fleet side, and expeditionary advanced basing operations on the Marine Corps side, but we integrated those in a very challenging scenario. And that scenario was a scenario that was endorsed by the Joint Staff. So we felt like we were using a scenario that was recognized within the Pentagon, that both OSD, CAPE, and the Joint Staff supported, and we were coming at it in an integrated fashion. One of the things we changed in this assessment is we took a look at, for the first time, non-program of record. So we took a look at unmanned, but because it's conceptual, there were a lot of caveats and assumptions. And so when we came up with our final analysis, it came up with a discrete number of ships, which was north of 355, and then separately unmanned, because again, they're conceptual. But another really important piece of this integrated force structure assessment is that we don't intend to let it sit in the shelf for 3 years. And so we intend for this assessment to be updated every year by now a larger volume of exercises, experimentation, war game and analysis and studies that we're doing, so that it informs every budget cycle. So that North Star and the mix, which is critically important, is going to change. And what we're really focused on, I think if I could speak for the Commandant for a second, isn't necessarily the numbers of platforms, but it's the capabilities that the Navy brings to the fight. And so we're part of a joint team, right? And we're not going to win unless we fight as a joint team. So what unique naval capabilities do we bring to the fight? Think integrated air wing on an aircraft carrier. Think about what submarines bring to the fight, or a multi-mission DDG that does ASW and has long-range inland strike capabilities and those types of things. So that, in with other joint capabilities, helps determine what we bring to the fight that is then going to translate into platforms and a mix of platforms over time.
Commandant?
Just to extend that beyond the scenario of what it takes to win that kind of a fight, I think the learning that we're all going through is, in a more macro sense, to accomplish what the National Defense Strategy tells us. What does it take to deter elsewhere in the world,
right,
in addition to the fight that you're in? So the number, how many or what type of ship do we need, has to factor in not only what it takes to win in any given scenario, but concurrently with that, to deter something bad from happening around the rest of the world. And I couldn't have stated any better. Part of the magic of how do you deter and how do you win in a conflict is how you're going to fight, which is changing. It's changing.
And it ties back to the previous question on OFRP, right? So we are challenging the assumptions in OFRP because we need a construct to produce both the ready forces today and the surge forces we need in the bench in order to meet, as the Commandant said, not only the fight you're in, but how do you set the globe to deter an opportunistic peer competitor as well, and still meet those 5 National Defense Strategy mission areas to deter conventionally and strategically and respond to threats, assure allies and partners, and so on.
Commandant Schultz, I'm not sure how it works. There isn't, I've never heard like a 355 number for the Coast Guard, some analogy. Right. I've heard, you want to shoot for 25 offshore patrol cutters and 58 Sentinel-class patrol boats. I think your program of record for the national security cutter is still 8, but Congress continues to give you a new one each year, which is, totally cool. How do you think of in terms of the overall capabilities needed in the Coast Guard?
Sure, and it's interesting. I follow with keen interest the conversations about the number for the Navy. I spoke recently at Surface Naval Association, sort of talked maybe the conversation, a different lens to look through might be a conversation about a national fleet. I was in Pascagoula on Saturday, commissioned the 9th National Security Cutter. There's a good story there. That was a program of record of 8 ships. We've got stable Coast Guard requirements. We know the ship we need. We've got a very capable shipbuilder. We had Senator Roger Wicker and Congressman Steve Palazzo there. We got informed members of Congress that see the value those ships are delivering to the nation every day. So that was the 9th. We've got 2 ships on budget, the 10th and the 11th. There's ongoing conversation about whether there's going to be a 12th or not. For me, it's not a specific number, but it's those national security cutters on the high end. Those are our flagships, global deployers, skiff-enabled. Again, below the level of armed conflict. They got some self-defense capabilities, but it's not missile equipped, so there's limited applications. 25 offshore patrol cutters. That's going to be a 360-foot ship. Similar capabilities, not quite the speed or air search radar, but that's a global deployer. And I look at what do those 36 plus ships contribute to the fight. We just awarded the contract back in April last year for a polar security cutter. That's going to be a roughly 460-foot ship to reach the high latitudes on both ends of the world. And we just got production underway. We're doing detailed design. Still on that first ship, cut steel next year. The 21 budget includes funding for production on number 2. So I think the conversation's hopefully building to 3. We're having a conversation about what a medium icebreaker. So I don't have a number in mind, Bob, but it's amount of capability. I look at it from effect. What effect is the Coast Guard trying to have? And then do we build the fleet towards that effect? We're also looking to step out on some number around 36 waterways commerce cutters, supply the nation's waters, enable the 45,000 federal aids to navigation. We're building out domestic program of record of 58 fast response cutters. We took the acceptance on the 37th. We're sending 6 over to support Mike's 5th fleet over there on the Arabian Gulf here on the maritime security mission. So there's not a specific number. It's really how much capability the Coast Guard needs to do our organic Coast Guard missions and then contribute to the joint force.
I would just add, though, the trend, clearly, we're going to need more unmanned. We're going to need more smaller, lower signature capable ships that can fight dispersed. We know the trend lines are really clear.
Mm-hmm. I want to pull on this integration string because both of you brought it up, and I want to hit you last, Commandant, because there's a very interesting article written by a Marine infantryman about how the Coast Guard might integrate. But in your initial Frago CNO, in an 8-page document, you mentioned integration 7 times. If anything, Commandant, in your Commandant's planning guidance, I mean, you pushed integration even further. Can you give the audience a sense, where is this headed? It's kind of ill-defined. I mean, other than the fact that we want to integrate, I think everybody thinks that's a great idea. But both of you arrived before you could really affect the 21 budget, so now there's a canvas open for you. So can you kind of paint the canvas for the audience on where you think this integration is going to go?
I'll start if you want. For me, it goes back to 2016 to 2018 timeframe, driven by a series of war games and exercises when I was in Hawaii with Not So Swift and Shags O'Shaughnessy, Admiral Harris. Each war game, or at least it could have been before I got there, but every single war game for those 2 years, the conclusion was, if you're going to maintain an advantage over a nation like China, then you're going to have to operate in a different way than you are right now. And the different way, in other words, the different way is integration. It is the asymmetric advantage that the U.S. has. The ability to operate, 1, combined arms, but 2, as an expeditionary naval force, no one else is close. So push the limits on that maintain that margin of advantage that you have. So it wasn't out of emotion. It was driven purely by logic. The results are the same every time. Keep fighting the same with the same warfighting concept and the same capabilities, the outcome is going to be the same. We have to change. So the integration, to me, driven by the tactical to operational end. That's where that has to drive it back up to the top.
And so, will we see in the integrated force structure assessment new ships that reflect more integration, or are there any other things that would be concrete that people could say, oh, wow, this is really happening?
When that force structure assessment is finally released, you will see discrete ships that we're bringing online. They're smaller amphibs in terms of, and they're connectors really to move, to take advantage of the mobility of the Fleet Marine Force and move them to places where they can bring effects to bear, both kinetic and non-kinetic, to help us with both sea control and sea denial.
Cool. Now, Commandant, I mentioned an article was written by a Marine infantry officer who is an exchange officer in Colombia. And the title of the article was Integrate with the Marines, ... and who else? And I I almost thought he was a former Coast Guardsman, because he basically said integrating the Coast Guard better into the great power competition model with both the Navy and the Marines would be a virtuous thing. And so have you had the opportunity to talk more? Are there Coast Guard, Navy, Marine Corps talks going on how we might be able to push this also?
Yeah, that Marine, I think, wrote 2 very insightful articles. I had a chance to see them both, Bob, and I think I really appreciate his perspective. You'd almost think the Commandant wrote that and put the Marine Corps Commander or Colonel's name on there. But I think at the end of the day, Mike's team, Dave's team, my team, we're together. You know, we're sort of looking back to the 21st Century Cooperative Strategy from 2015. Our teams are working. It's a little ahead of that to talk about that much here, but I look forward to that. I saw the CNOs, Frago, read it with great interest, and clearly, when the Coast Guard sits outside of the Department of Defense, it's a little different for the CNO to sort of write tasking in there. But I think with this document we're working on, I have the privilege not being by law a member of the Joint Chiefs, but I sit at the pleasure of the chairman and the SecDef at the table. I think we're having those conversations. So I absolutely think that Marines thinking is where we're heading a little bit. That integrated solution set, I hope, will involve the Coast Guard. And again, it's you think about the complexity of the problem sets, you think about the National Defense Strategy and competing powers. It is a continuum. And, when the CNO can put the shooters in places where you need shooters, and possibly a national security cutter could scratch an itch, sanctions enforcement, other type work, capacity building, why wouldn't we want to be part of that conversation? So I think we're in a good spot, heading to a better spot. I look very much look forward to sort of just tightening up and solidifying this and sort of rolling out this new thinking here for the nation's naval forces, maritime security forces, however we decide to sort of banner that. I think it's an exciting time, it's an important time in this National Defense Strategy, actioning that. There's more work there for all of us, for any of us. I think the collaboration, the cooperation is the magic there.
I think it's good that he wrote. I'm pretty sure when I was at that rank, I'd never worked with the Coast Guard, didn't think of, I don't know about you, but it wasn't even, I don't remember the first time I worked with the Coast Guard, but it wasn't at that rank. The fact that it's being thought about, talked about, is good.
And this year, Bob, just on that note, we're some of the audience here, we're up in Alaska. I went up with the former secretary for the Arctic Expeditionary Capabilities Exercise. Anyway, Coast Guard C-130s, we had Coast Guard Maritime Security Response Units around the naval combatants that were in there doing the exercise. There was fuel transfers, there's a P-8 up there. I think there's absolutely, I say, beyond niche capabilities that we can bring to that fight. So I'm really excited about this enhanced integration here that I think all the sea services are about getting after.
Just one more add. So the Commandant alluded to it, but and we haven't talked about this publicly before, but our staffs are working together on a tri-service maritime strategy that should be presented to us by the summer. And so we are trying to bring things together from a top-down perspective in a more integrated way.
Yeah.
Great. I want to ask each of you a detailed question. I'll pose 2 of them to each of you. So I'll just go around one, and then I'll go around another time. Commandant, in 21, you dropped Marine Corps end strength by 2,000, and you testified last week that 22 and 23 you might see more. So obviously you're making these to free up headroom to pursue other capabilities. Can you give us a sense on the type of capabilities you're going to go after?
Historically, like you know, we have grown and contracted the Marine Corps over our history when we needed to. This is the time when we have to get smaller to get better. If we're going to be an integrated part, if we're going to actually directly contribute to sea control, sea denial, then we got to have capabilities we don't have right now. We got to hold at risk naval platforms, a body of water, a piece of littoral terrain, and those are capabilities we don't have right now, but we need to get. So rather than hold on to a larger force structure and not be able to make the change, not be able to pivot in the direction we got to go, we're making a conscious decision to go there. So we will contract some. I don't know how far, but the end result will be a much more capable Marine Corps that's maintains the asymmetric, the advantage that we have to have in a unique way.
So you know, the Ford aircraft carrier elevators have been in the news a lot. Can you bring us up to speed, and how is the Ford doing overall?
Yeah, so on the elevators, we've doubled the number of operational elevators. We'll certify another in here in another month or so, 2 more this summer. Let me talk about Ford for just a second. I am very bullish on that carrier and the capability it brings not only to the fleet but to the nation. So we've got 2 nuclear power plants that are certified for deployment. Ship will spend 50% of the next year at sea. The only ships we have with that kind of op tempo are probably the rotor-based DDGs. Her flight deck's been certified for all type model series aircraft that are gonna deploy with her in her first deployment. Her flight deck will be certified by the end of this month. She'll be operational at the end of the month, and she will be the East Coast carrier for carrier quals for the next year. Last month, she was out for a 20-day period, logged some 7,000 miles. They were chasing the highest seas they could find in order to test the elevators. We're bringing shipyard workers to sea with us. We have streamlined the work that we need to do, the phasing that we need to do over the next year, so that we're trying to sustain momentum between import and at-sea periods, so that we bring the ship about a year from now, next April, we begin to enter a 4-month shock trial period, and then after that, we're going to see what we can do with her operationally for an extended period of time. The dual-band radar is performing very well. The story about the elevators is that, the punchline is that the elevators are broken. The elevators are not fully constructed. They're not built. And so we have 4 fully built right now. We'll have 7 by the end of the summer, and the remaining 4 will finish in 2021. But the path to those has really been good over the past several months. We feel like we have figured out what the main limiting factors have and are moving pretty steadily to stay on schedule with delivering those elevators.
Commandant Schultz, you mentioned the polar cutters. This has been something that was talked about when I was the Undersecretary back in 2009, and it just never seemed to go anywhere. Is that program now going to be funded, and are we going to have capabilities for the high and north and the?
Yeah, there's absolutely a good news story there. I think if you think about the purpose of this conference, and we're thinking about the world through the lens of the National Defense Strategy, both China and Russia, who are really the competing global powers at the center of the strategy, have made the Arctic a priority. You know, one is a legitimate Arctic nation, and the other is a self-declared near-Arctic state. But, you know, China's operating up off the Alaskan Arctic. They're keenly interested in the availability of natural resources, rare, minerals on the ocean's floor, 1/3 of the untapped LNG in the world. They're paying attention to what we're doing as we site 5th-generation fighters up there in the state of Alaska. There's that piece. There's Russia, who looks at a ship out of Shanghai. If you provide ice-breaking service across the northern sea route, you can knock 2 weeks off that transit. So they see the Arctic as an economic generator. I mean, today, about 24% of their GDP is derived from Arctic activity. So through the context of the National Defense Strategy, the Arctic regions are absolutely important. To answer your question, we got funding in 2020 in the spring, 2019 in the spring for that first polar security cutter, the detailed design and construction contract. So that's a good start to that. But we're chasing China. China will have more ice-breaking capability as a self-declared near-Arctic state than the United States government by 2025. You know, they have a ship they got from the Ukrainians, a Snow Dragon 1. They built a second Snow Dragon 2 last year in China. They're building a heavy breaker. You know, Russia, you hear the number 50 icebreakers. They've got about 4 to 8 really capable nuclear breakers. They're building more nukes. They're building LNG breakers. I mean, they are doubling down in the Arctic. So we're having a conversation with the Congress, within the administration, about more breakers. That's great. We spent about a decade sort of conditioning the space about the importance. I think it was this pivot to this global competing powers that really pushed the conversation over the edge here a little bit to start recognizing we are playing catch-up ball. So I talk about a 6-3-1 strategy. We need minimum of 6 icebreakers. 3 of them need to be these heavy polar security cutters. We're having a conversation about requirements builds for what a medium breaker might look like. And, today the conversation's the East-South China Sea from a freedom of navigation, but think about a contested northern sea route. What capabilities are going to go up there and operate there? It's probably something that looks and operates like a polar security cutter. The conversation may be well beyond 3 of those. But I think the good news is we're actioning that. We're off to the races. Late 23, 24, the first polar security cutter will splash, and we'll put it to work. That first ship's probably going to spend most of her time down in Antarctica breaking out McMurdo Station. I was down there recently and visited our 44-year-old icebreaker, which before we take her out of service will be our 50-year-old polar icebreaker, Polar Star. She's the world's most capable 75,000 horsepower non-nuclear breaker, but she's on life support, Bob. So this is a good thing for the nation, but we're clearly playing catch-up ball.
Cool. Commandant, you mentioned unmanned systems just a few minutes ago, and kind of implicit in your planning guidance, and I think you said there's going to be a large number of human-machine special purpose MAGTFs out there, my word, not yours, that can be more easily inserted from possibly longer range and really be able to do things differently in the past. Do you want to talk about that? I'd like to get to the audience here soon, so I'd like to ask that the answers be as concise as you can.
In the range from totally unmanned, which isn't, of course, totally unmanned, to fully manned, and the whole spectrum in between, we have to exploit it. Again, not because we love science, but because it allows you to cover a bigger frontage. It allows you to operate over a greater span of space than if you're exclusively just manned. The life-saving part of it clearly important, but from a warfighting perspective, it allows you to operate on a persistent basis over a much larger frontage. So we got to push hard now. The competitors are pushing hard now. We have to push hard now. Probably the space we got to learn the most about is the teaming aspect that you talked about. How is man and machine actually going to work together to produce like 1 + 1 = something more like 4 or 5? We have to move fast.
CNO, in the 21 budget, the recommendation is to decommission the first 4 LCSs. Is there a story behind this move, or does it reflect growing Navy dissatisfaction with the ships? They're not going to be as important in the future fleet as once thought. Can you give us a little sense on what your thoughts are there?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So let me take the second piece of it first. So we're going to have a fleet of 31 littoral combat ships. And so the question is, what are we going to do with those ships? We think we're in a good place right now with respect to the organization on both coasts. We're going to have 14 in the East Coast, 17 on the West Coast. We think that we've done a good job with crewing, and we're testing the Blue and Gold. We're testing it. We're deploying it this year. We think we got the organization down, and we've invested a lot in training. So we feel like foundationally we're in a much better place than we've been. In terms of mission modules, we're delivering the surface mission module. We're delivering the Naval Strike Missile now that gives us an over-the-horizon cruise missile capability. We're due the final testing on the ASW modules on both variants this year. They'll make their maiden deployment in 22, and right after that, the mine countermeasures capability will deploy as well. So right now we're deploying 5 of those ships this year. We've got 2 of them down in the Southcom AOR, 2 of them in Indo-PACOM, a 5th coming out here to deploy. We're using the Blue and Gold construct. We've successfully fired Naval Strike Missile off of Gabriel Giffords. We have done a good job down in Southcom in particular in the sustainability piece using Gitmo as kind of our hub. We will double, and within a couple of years, we'll double the amount of deployed LCSs simultaneously. So if I get to so we need to use those ships. We need to get serious about using those ships. We have thousands of sailors that are well-trained and excited about those ships. We need to get the capability on them so they're operationally relevant, and that's what we're focused on. And I think testimony to that is we're delivering those modules and deploying those ships. And the COCOMs want more of them. We'll follow up at the heels of these Southcom and Indo-PACOM deployments with CENTCOM and EUCOM right afterwards. With the first 4, so we made a decision a number of years ago in order to give capability to LCS 5 and beyond, and particularly the block buys we did in 2015. We decided we needed to do much more testing and use those first 4 hulls so that we better understand what were the issues with respect to hull maintenance and engineering that kept on plaguing us, right? And kept us from getting those ships to sea. What do we need to do in terms of upgrades, in terms of power generation, in terms of other warfighting capabilities, whether it was electronic warfare or C4I or the gunfire control system? So we use those first hulls to test, and we put no money into upgrading them like the rest of the fleet. So in order to put them in the same par as the rest of the LCS class, it would cost about another $2 billion over the fit-up. So that was a tough decision to make on whether we wanted to put that money towards those existing LCSs or retire them, move on with the rest of the class, and then take that $2 billion and put it in the SCN account for different capability. The bottom line, Bob, is those first 4 ships are not bringing lethality to the fight. They're not bringing capability to the fight, and I just didn't see the return on investment to do that.
Thanks.
Yep.
Commandant Schultz, we know the basic outlines: national security cutter, offshore patrol cutter, fast response cutter, the Arctic cutters. What is the next big capability that you think the Coast Guard needs to bring in to improve its overall capabilities in our national defense strategy?
Yeah, in terms of capabilities, Bob, I mean, I talked about the cutters. I won't rehash that, but I think aviation-wise, we're watching future vertical lift. We're flying a fleet of 98 Dolphin, Aerospatial Dolphin helicopters that are beyond any hours anybody's flying, and we got to pay attention to that. It's a composite aircraft. We'll be flying them north of 30,000 hours. Our MH-60s, Sikorsky birds, we need to probably drive down that fleet of 98 Dolphins and take our fleet of 45, 46 MH-60s and drive that up as we sort of look down the road on what our DoD colleagues are doing with future vertical lift. I think that's important. We're missionizing our C-27s. We got 14 C-27Js in a swap with the U.S. Air Force and the Fire Service with some old H models, and we're putting the Minotaur platform on board, so we'll have commonality with our CBP Air Marine colleagues within DHS, with our Navy and other colleagues, defense colleagues. That's a good story there. And then we're bringing on board C-130Js. We've got the 17th came in the budget last year. We're building out to a program of 22. So I think it's continuing the momentum on the surface capabilities. It's precedent on the air capabilities. Keenly, the readiness thing for me, though, really, Bob, it's the people. It's in a competitive environment where less than a third of Americans, 28, 29%, are eligible to serve. I got to go find about 3,700 of them every year. My DoD brethren are bringing in about 1,000 every couple of days. So it's really, having those, we get the same entitlement, the same pay. But things like tuition assistance, I fund that at 50% because I'm constrained on the O&S top line. It's training, it's professional development. That's where we got to really, as we drive up our readiness and get on a good trajectory, I think we remain a more competitive employer.
Thank you. I'm going to be shifting over to questions from the audience. So those who want to pose a question, you can head up to the microphone. But I want to ask the CNO one other question. I read that...
It's a bonus question.
This is a bonus question. I read that one of our P-8s was lased by a Chinese ship. I wanted to know, is it true? What actions have we taken with the Chinese? And do we have the protective gear for our pilots who are operating in the Western Pacific against these kind of attacks?
It happened. It's the first time we saw it happen from that type of PLAN ship. We do have protective gear on board for our pilots, and importantly, they're also trained to deal with it. But it is I can't confirm it is the first time we saw it. We have the U.S. government's demarche the Chinese.
Thank you. All right, who's first?
Hi, Megan Eckstein with USNI News. Thank you all very much for being here. Admiral Gilday and General Berger, you both spoke about the need to have the Naval Integrated Force be ready and have a capable, credible surge force. From the civilian leadership, we've heard a lot about growing in capacity, whether it's Secretary Esper committing to 355 or Secretary Modley even talking about 390. So I wonder if there's a discrepancy maybe between uniformed and civilian leadership, or kind of how you can maybe address the readiness versus capacity issue.
I'll start off. I think there's no disagreement at all that any growth in the military has to factor in readiness. We're not going towards a hollow force. Between the military and civilian side, there may have been some different views on that in the past, but it's pretty rare. If you're going to add one more of anything, it's got to be ready. So no one is headed towards a hollow, large force at all, which is why I think the CNO mentioned if we're allowed to grow, above the force level that we have right now, it's got to come with the resources that sustain that over time, the people, the training, the maintenance, the whole package.
Yeah, I think if you take a look at analysis that's done, whether it's inside the Pentagon or outside, every analysis has been consistent in numbers north of 355. And so what the Secretary of Defense has said he wants to do is take the existing force structure assessment, which in its essence is a requirements document that both the Commandant and I sign out, and he wants to run that through a series of war games, deeper studies, bring in outside entities to take a look, which we welcome. And so that's why earlier I talked more about capabilities that will translate into platforms than I did specific numbers. You can chase those numbers all day long, and I'm not sure it's very productive or satisfying.
Just one other thought that comes to mind. There's also an evolution of thinking in readiness itself.
Yeah.
It's not just the availability of something. It's ready to do something specific. It's ready at a certain time. So what unit of measure do we use for readiness? So our readiness tools that we've had for decades, we have to evolve them as well, if that makes sense to you. A much more refined view of what does ready mean.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, CNO, Commandant. IS-1 Minor from Strategic Command. My question is for you, CNO. Whether it's 310 ships or 355 ships, how do we plan to recruit and retain to man those vessels? We're already facing manning issues at sea with our existing force, and we're seeing drawdowns and incentives like TA and reenlistment bonuses. How do I help you get our recruiting and our retention above the 74, 78% into the higher 80s to try to man these ships that we've been talking about building all morning?
Yeah, so I take a little bit more positive outlook. So the 78% retention is above our benchmark. Tuition assistance, we did see a dip in that in 2019, but I am committed to fully funding it. And we have funded so many other personnel-related incentive programs, including if I go all the way left to families, where readiness really begins, and taking a look at what we're doing with child care in terms of buying back 5,000 child care seats this year, in terms of buying more, in terms of paying for more child care providers. If you take a look at what we've done with My Navy HR in terms of the apps that we've put out there for sailors to use, in terms of the detailing marketplace, the ability to do a PCS move, to set up the PCS move online, to do all of your travel claims using the app, to have an app that doesn't require a CAC that you can use from your phone. For your family to set up childcare, for your family to set up housing off of those same apps. In terms of other things that we've done, so we brought back meritorious promotions, right? And so we've gone from 5% when we initiated a couple of years ago to 20% now, where commanders actually get to say, these are the sailors that I think that merit promotion. We've provided incentives in terms of advancements for those tough positions at sea that we're trying to attract really able, willing, and qualified E5s and E6s to get promoted to E6 and E7 based on taking those tough assignments if they qualify for them. And then in terms of the frustrating chase against closing gaps at sea, so the budget in 21 pays for an additional 7,000 sailors. And so what we are trying to do, what we're trying to do is quality of life, quality of work to help retain you, the sailors around you, and importantly, their families. I hope that answers your question in terms of some of our focus, but those programs, those transformative programs in HR, we have tried to fully fund those as best we can.
Thanks for asking that question, because we talked readiness and capabilities.
Yeah.
Didn't really get to personnel. So, Commandant Schultz, I'd like to and bring it to the Commandant. Allow each of you to...
Sure, I would echo the CNO. It's competitive, and young people have many choices. We've done some things in terms of, across our workforce. We have a workforce of 15% women in an environment across America where 50% women are staffing the workforce. We're trying to bring more women to the organization. We have some success stories there. The United States Coast Guard Academy graduating class of 2020 here is going to be it's about 40% women. And the entire population academy is 40%. That's a good news story, but we've got to bring more women to ranks. We're focused on diversity and inclusion. We've got to have a Coast Guard that looks more like the nation we serve. The touch points from a recruiting standpoint, they'll go bring an African-American female on board, a Hispanic male, a woman. They're almost 2 to 3 to 1 in some cases. So we really need to get our recruiters in places we haven't been before. We need to grow our number of recruiters. We've done some things in terms of, we have many geographically dispersed small units. If you're at a boat station on the Pacific Northwest coast, there's 30 shipmates. A young female Coast Guardsman goes out and has her first or second child. We have child care up to 84 days away, care for second givers, but it's a lot of pressure and stigma to take off for 84 days because your shipmates are carrying a lot of load here. We just come up with a program where we backfill that sailor with a reservist so they can go and they can make the family adjustments, they can settle things in. Child development centers, I have 9 across the Coast Guard, 8 or 9 across the Coast Guard. So we're really working with Congress on subsidies. We can put our hand on that rheostat with the subsidy and help pay folks in high-cost areas. We've had some success there. We're looking to continue to press that conversation. So it is a competitive environment. We're trying to do some different thinking. We're trying to have more permeability in the workforce. I think it's cyber ratings. We're training most of the cyber professionals here in North America in the armed services. How do we keep them in? I think we got to think about permeability from active to reserve to private sector to back in. Mike's team has done some innovative things with, I think, the gold ticket, the silver ticket. You can come back in and you don't have to play catch up on where you left the service. It's competitive for pilots. So we're trying to do some kind of busting our thinking of yesteryear and being a lot more forward thinking about human talent management. I call it the mission ready total workforce, and we're really inside the Coast Guard Lifelines changing our thinking there, Bob.
Commandant?
Are you on your second enlistment?
I'm preparing to re-enlist for my third, Commandant.
Yeah. Why'd you stay in?
Because I love this uniform.
Yeah. I think we need to pay attention to that. I'm not, everything that my 2 shipmates said, I 100% agree with. But at the end of the day, I think you stayed in because you felt like you were making a difference and you liked the team that you're on, right? I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but at the end of the day, that's why we join an organization. That's why we stay. Am I making a difference? Do I like this team? Our job is to make the life on the team better. All the things that they said, so that it's not a choice between having a family or having a career. We have to do everything humanly possible to make that team better. But at the end of the day, the other half is still true. Are you making a difference? So if we're not making it possible for Coast Guardsmen or soldiers or Marines, if they don't feel like they're making a difference, we're going to lose them. We're going to lose them. Because they're not going to stay for money. They're not going to stay for other. They have to stay because they're making a difference. Because what they do matters. What you do matters, right? You're protecting the nation. This is what we do.
Thank you, Petty Officer.
Thank you all.
Next one.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here. My name is Mallory Shelbourne with Inside Defense. Admiral Gilday, you mentioned a new tri-service maritime strategy. I'm wondering if there's any additional details you can share on what that might look like and how the sea services will use that moving forward in conjunction with the National Defense Strategy.
Yeah, so it'll be informed by the National Defense Strategy, but I can't provide any additional details yet. The teams have been working on it for about 2.5, 3 months, but we haven't seen any of those results yet.
And you said this summer you're expecting to complete it?
We expect to see something in the summer based on that work.
And when do you think the public might see something?
Good question. Probably shortly thereafter.
Thank you so much.
Gentlemen, thank you for your time this morning. Lieutenant Commander Vantries, VFA 192 Operations Officer. This question is directed primarily at Admiral Gilday, and it relates directly to personnel, but certainly impacts long-term readiness. Several communities, including aviation, are facing significant shortages of officers and enlisted personnel during maintenance phase. What efforts have been made, if any, to better utilize the experience and capabilities of our reserve sailors to augment our active duty force, enabling more opportunity to train to and maintain an increasingly complex tactical edge and improve quality of life during maintenance phase?
Yeah, so the answer to properly manning our ships is not to bring reserves in to fill those gaps. We're looking at, fully manning to the numbers that we're supposed to have on our ships a full year out for when they're going to begin training. So this is well into the maintenance cycle. And so that's what we're cited on. And so how do we change the way we're rotating the force in order to make sure that we're properly filling all of those gaps? Some of those are just a question of quantity of sailors. And so again, I go back to a point that I made in the last question about putting more money to manpower so that we have sufficient amount of well-trained sailors to fill those positions.
Commandant Schultz, Commandant Berger, do either of you want to jump in on?
Great.
The only thing I'll add in that, and just from a reserve standpoint, not a maintenance standpoint, we're a reserve of about 7,000. At one point, we were authorized up to 10,000, never got above 8,100. We are doubling down on our Coast Guard reserve. We've got to make more active duty members that leave the service for whatever reason. Maybe it's a change in life, a working spouse, elderly parent. Jumping into the reserves has got to be a preferred choice. And right now, we're losing in that space. So we're doing some things, first time in more than a decade, tuition assistance for our reservists, not just our reservists on active orders, but tuition assistance for reservists. Hopefully that's a plus. And then, someone leaves active duty, we put them at a port security unit. 6 months later, they deploy for 9 months. That's not the model where they want to be. So we're really taking a hard look inside the Coast Guard at our reserve programs. I think we got some exciting things coming out here in the coming months.
Thank you, gentlemen.
We have about 5 minutes, so these will be the last two.
Rick Easton, retired SWO. First of all, thanks very much for an excellent panel this morning. My question is for Admiral Gilday. CNO, sir. If I understand it, I think the 2021 shipbuilding plan or report to Congress was put on hold as the budget was submitted. Do you see that being submitted or later, or will that be replaced by the force structure assessment? And then I know that Secretary Modley talked about, and I probably have the words wrong, but burning midnight oil to find several billions of dollars. How is that initiative to help the reinvestment, particularly I think in the shipbuilding plan, but how is that initiative going, and where do you see that outcome?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So on the shipbuilding plan, the question really is whether it's going to be informed by the 2016 force structure assessment or whether you use the integrated force structure assessment that we just finished to fully inform it. And so, as the Secretary of Defense said, he wants to take a deeper look at the integrated force structure assessment and then make a decision on whether or not that informs the shipbuilding plan. And so, in due time, he's indicated that when he's satisfied, he'll release both. On the second piece about the Secretary's initiative to find money in the inside, so publicly, I've said that in order to grow the fleet, we need a higher top line. And so the first thing that we need to do responsibly, and we started doing this after our budget submission ended for 21, is to take a deeper look on the inside, basically put everything on the table, challenge our assumptions, and see what money we could shift. Not just it won't just translate to the shipbuilding account, but it'll translate to the wholeness that goes along with that we've been talking about this morning.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And this will be our last question.
Good morning, gentlemen. Captain Sean Rushlow. I'm going to take a little different tack to global peer competition. So CSBA recently wrote a 2-volume paper, How to Win the War Without Fighting. And then March issue of USNI kind of focuses on building strategic partners. If you were to grade the whole of government response as compared to, say, the Cold War, what would that grade be? And then what elements of theater security cooperation would you build upon so we have that network of partners? Thank you.
You want to start with the comment?
So the grade, I didn't think about the grade. I think there's whole of government and the national defense strategy. I think there's tremendous opportunities there. I think we're focusing on, the lethality piece, with the Coast Guard, we're figuring out how we fit under that, that threshold below armed conflict. I would tell you, there is tremendous opportunities. As I mentioned, my travels through the ASEAN region, they talk about Coast Guards, capacity building. I look at the Philippine Navy's 4,000 people. They got 11,900 person Coast Guard marching to 35,000. How do you go in and help build capacity there? I think there are tremendous whole of government partnership opportunities there, that human to human. I mean, what are we trying to provide? We're trying to provide an alternative to coercive, antagonistic behaviors that challenge the rule-based order, the free and open seas. And I think that we got to think about that through a lens that's very broad, not just through the military lens. So I think there's tremendous opportunities. I think we can bring more in the fight. We did a 30-day operation in September last year with a 225-foot buoy tender and a patrol boat. And it's called Apa Ayinga, which means family. And we did it around the Samoans, but we offered an alternative. This year we'll be back with a similar mothership, another buoy tender, a couple expeditionary capable patrol boats. We're fielding additional expeditionary patrol boats, fast response cutters in Guam. I think that competition for ideals, Western ideals, I look at what the Kiwis, the Aussies are doing in the region. How do we lash up internationally and whole of government? I think there's some real opportunities to think about this. We got to be ready for conflict, but really we hope to be operating and staying below conflict. It's that competition continuum from my perspective.
Sino?
I'd give us a solid B. I think it's really easy to be critical. I'm not saying that you are, but it's complex, right? It's not just complicated, it's complex to bring all those elements of government together. If you look across diplomatic, informational, military, economic, you can see, whether you're thinking about Russia or China, you can think about things that we've been doing, whether it's been in the cyber domain with respect to the elections in terms of stuff that we've done both offensively and defensively, with respect to trade and the things we've done economically, in the diplomatic side as well. One important thing about the sea services, I think, is because of our forward presence and because of, navies meet all the time, not just in war, but in peace as well, and Coast Guards, and we work very closely together. And if you take a look at those other elements of the dime, particularly diplomatic and economic, you can see where naval forces play in to reinforce the overall intent of the U.S. government on a day-to-day basis.
Commandant?
It's really hard to compare two time frames that are and you're not exactly. They're different circumstances. But I think a lot of really bright people in the 50s, 60s, 70s who were focused on deterrence, conventional and strategic, and learned a lot of lessons, and we would be wise to read some books that they wrote. I think today I would agree. To me, the biggest battle going on right now in great power competition, and I would say in Indo-PACOM, perhaps is in the information space. Mm-hmm. All the others are part of it, but it's an area that's hardest to define. There aren't any easy courses to take where you can become an information environment expert quickly. You can't. But that's where the battle is taking place. Last part. Against a competitor and adversary like PRC, where you vacate a space, they occupy. So the persistence part isn't just to be visible and out there with your adversary or with your partners, with your allies. That's key. But void a space against that adversary, they'll be in it tomorrow, convincing the same people in the neighborhood that they're a better partner than you are. We have a lot to learn in the information space, and this is, I'm convinced, decades-long sort of competition. It's not a week, it's not a month. It's long-term. Sure.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Well, when I was the Deputy Secretary, I started using the term, and probably 90% of who's ever heard me say talk will hear this, but people ask me how I sleep at night. And I always respond, I sleep like a baby. I wake up crying every 2 hours. And what I say over and over and over again is the reason why I always go back to sleep is because of our people. Our true asymmetric advantage against any competitor, especially competitors who are authoritarian regimes, is the fundamental initiative, mission focus, and innovation of our young men and women who serve in all three of the sea services. And I think it's reflected right here in these three fine gentlemen. I think we're blessed at this time to have people of this caliber leading our services, and I'd ask you all to join me in thanking them for what they do and for their time this morning. I'll get you.
Secretary Work, General Berger, Admiral Gilday, Admiral Schultz, on behalf of AFCEA International and Naval Institute, we thank you. We know your time is precious. I echo Secretary Work's comments. We're lucky to have you in these leadership positions at this very important time. For each of you, we have a book, Strategy, Context, and Adaptation, Archidamus to Air Power, Naval Institute Press book with an AFCEA bookmark. It doesn't quite cover it, but it's a token of our appreciation. And again, let's thank our presenters.
Thanks so much.
Sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bob.
Ladies and gentlemen, we now move into a networking break in the exhibit hall, sponsored by Riverbed. We also hope you'll be able to join us